Canada is once again on the hunt for a new candidate to head the Human Rights Commission after the Fed's pick agreed to resign this week. The move follows weeks of controversy after his appointment and an investigation that looked into the process of his hiring. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post politics reporter Stephanie Taylor joins me to walk us through the controversy around the hiring, what the Fed's investigation revealed, and where that leaves our Human Rights Commission now. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Stephanie, after weeks of controversy, the government's pick to head the Human Rights Commission has resigned. And before we get into some of the controversy and the resignation, I guess for listeners who may not have been following her, who is Burcu Ditani? And when was he initially tapped to be the head of the Human Rights Commission?
So the government announced on June 14th that the Justice Minister had recommended that he be appointed to the new role. Now we find out that the application process actually started 2 years earlier, but he was appointed to the role back in June. And at the time, Mr. Ditani was lauded for having, a legal career. He had done school over in Europe, in London. He then had worked in the field of human rights at the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and then most recently as executive director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission for 3 years. And like many appointments, the Justice Minister said very complimentary things about his experience in human rights, his experience in law, his experience in human rights law was going to be beneficial to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which receives complaints and decides what to do about them when it comes to cases of discrimination. Does it dismiss them? Does it work to find a remedy? Does it forward them on to a tribunal that would then adjudicate them? Mr. Ditani at the time was also recognized as the first Muslim and racialized person to be holding this kind of role. That did not go unnoticed, but his appointment was not made with a lot of fanfare. It went out in a news release. I mean, typically in terms of government branches and government departments, the chief commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, although the commission itself is a very important one, it's not one that we are talking about all that often, and we're certainly not talking about the biography and who is kind of the chief commissioner. These are roles that typically are kind of quasi-judicial. They are the kind of personalities, the biography, the CV of the people in these roles are kind of in the background. We might read about the decisions they make, but this is not one appointment that a lot of reporters in Ottawa and others were kind of paying attention to when it was made.
And I can imagine that the fact that everyone started talking about it after the appointment was probably not something the government was expecting, nor really pleased about. And it wasn't long after the appointment that we started to see some controversy creep up about Mr. Ditani's appointment. What sparked the criticism of his appointment?
So it was media reports. Media reported, specifically the Globe and Mail was the first to report it, and the National Post and others also reported on this. But Jewish advocacy groups, prominent Jewish advocacy groups such as the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, flagged what they saw as concerning and troubling posts that Mr. Ditani had made nearly a decade ago, back when he was a graduate student. And some of these posts, some of them are now deleted in a former kind of Twitter X account of his, were characterized as anti-Israel. As a student and as kind of an early academic, it turned out that Mr. Ditani had been involved in not only academic writing about kind of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but in activism. He had spoken on a number of panels where he had made allegedly anti-Israel statements, anti-Israel posts. This, I think, would have always been something that sparked controversy, but particularly in light of October 7th of 2023, when even the current chief commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission has talked about a concerning rise in anti-Semitism. And we know from police services across the country, there has been an uptick in anti-Semitic and hate-related crimes against Jewish communities, against Muslim communities as well, have also been on the rise. But I think the political temperature of where these allegations came out were quite concerning to the government as well. It came at a time when the government is advancing something called the Online Harms Act. This is the sweeping legislation that is in terms of one of the things it wants to do is crack down on social media companies to ensure that they are not kind of becoming platforms where hateful and other kind of problematic and criminal things are being hosted on there. But they sought to give the Canadian Human Rights Commission more powers to investigate allegations of online hate speech. So this all of these factors really kind of got the attention of prominent Jewish advocacy organizations and Jewish leaders that were then raising concerns to the media and by extension to the government. When that triggered Justice Minister Refarani to say he did find these allegations troubling and that he was going to launch a review into what Mr. Datani had said or didn't say and kind of the process leading up to his appointment.
With this investigation, was it really a wide scope investigation? Were they looking at, his past social media? Were they looking at things that he may have written while he was an academic? Were they looking at his work in the Yukon? Was it just Datani himself, or was it the process and, what questions were asked, how the bureaucracy handled its own vetting of Mr. Datani?
The investigation itself, the results of which have become public this week, had the mandate of looking at one, the allegations of did Mr. Datani post and say what he was alleged to have said, and they focused specifically on that of his activities and his past of when he was a student. So again, this is back in London. This is about a decade ago. So this is really kind of the concentrated time. And it's worth noting that Justice Minister Refarani, as other government officials said when he was appointed, that they had really had no idea that this was kind of the first time they were learning about the past and the statements. And the investigation not only looked to substantiate these allegations of did Mr. Datani participate in these activities, but then did he inform the government. Now, the Privy Council Office, which is the administrative arm of the Prime Minister's office, which is in charge of doing the background screening and vetting, they looked at their own processes separately and said, okay, there's an administrative oversight. We clearly didn't, check everything as thoroughly as we should. Our security partners have since gone ahead and done this. And as there were kind of two investigations, one being the independent external one into what Mr. Datani said and posted as a student, the others in terms of the government vetting, you had the opposition Conservatives saying that this was a failure on the part of the government's vetting process. And Jewish advocates were also saying the same thing as well, that how did the government not know? How did the government not do a search? How did the government not enter, an individual's name to see maybe what their social media record looked like? I mean, the year is 2024. I think all of us are now used to knowing that what it is we post and we say, there's a digital footprint and there's a digital record that follow us. So the government was faced with a lot of questions about, how the government didn't know this when it came to this appointment.
We'll be right back. So as you mentioned, the investigation report was released publicly this week. What did the findings show about Mr. Datani's online activities and also the process by which he was appointed?
So the report concluded that Mr. Datani had, quote unquote, kind of downplayed the nature of what he had said and what he had posted. So the report found that as a student, he did make what the report considered to be anti-Israel posts. And what it flagged as concerning was that he seemed to, in the interviews they had done with him, seemed to kind of downplay the level of criticism that he used. So the report was careful to say that the fact that he was, say, involved in advocacy and criticism about the actions of Israel doesn't necessarily say he can't perform the role of being a chief commissioner. In fact, the report points out that his knowledge of this conflict could have actually been framed as an asset. But what they said was that he made efforts to downplay, quote unquote, this is a direct quote, made efforts to downplay the critical nature of his work, which it said was concerning. And the report found that Mr. Datani did fail to disclose this level of activism and the nature of what he posted when it came to Israel. He didn't disclose this to the government in the application and in the process to him of him being appointed, which the report said deprived the government of the opportunity to have any kind of a talk to Mr. Detani and to respond. So one of the other issues the report also examined is that some of these anti-Israel posts Mr. Detani had made were under a different name. And this was an issue as well with the government, because the government said that they simply didn't know that there were other names when it came in play. And the report found that Mr. Detani's explanation, when it interviewed him in the context of their investigation, where Mr. Detani said he had kind of, whimsically, chosen which name to use, the report found that that wasn't that credible, that he was very intentional, and that when it came to actually filling out the background screening application earlier this spring and filling out the documents that an appointee of his level needed to fill out, he didn't actually specify these other names. Now, Mr. Detani issued and released his kind of own rebuttal to some of these assertions the report makes, saying that he felt he was as transparent as he could, and that he felt that if the government screening process had any kind of further questions, they could have simply asked him about it, but that in his mind, he was as honest and transparent as he could about his past, where the government report actually finds the opposite, where it concludes that it appears on what it calls kind of the balance of probabilities that he admitted some of this information about his past academic work, about his past scholarship, about his past activism, and about his past posts.
And that brings us to Mr. Detani's resignation. Despite his defense of his handling of the vetting process leading up to his appointment, he did ultimately agree to resign. Why did he agree to resign? And what did he have to say in his resignation?
So there's still an outstanding question, and I think the language "agreed to resign" is quite interesting, because from Mr. Detani's statement, he released. We learn a little bit more of a timeline about how this all happened. So Mr. Detani said that he received a letter from Justice Minister Arif Virani in late July, where Minister Virani says that he had received the final report from this external investigation, and it flagged, in the minister's words, concerning points about how honest and open Mr. Detani had been with the government about his past activities, and that Minister Virani told him he was going to consider whether he needed to recommend removing him from this post. Mr. Detani, through his legal counsel, responds the next day, as I said, saying that he felt he was as honest and open he could be. And in that August 1st letter back to the government, Mr. Detani actually offers to say that he would be willing to make a joint statement. He would be willing to demonstrate his commitment to kind of, answer to some of the concerns that are being raised by advocates and stakeholders, and make a statement about his commitment to human rights. From that August 1st letter up until this week, we're not privy to what happened in terms of discussions behind the scenes. But ultimately, what we do know is that Mr. Detani resigned. The Justice Minister accepted his resignation. The Justice Minister says that he's going to now begin the process to search for a new Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Some Conservative MPs took to online to raise this idea of perhaps was there any kind of a settlement. We don't know that. I asked Justice Minister Arif Virani's office, was there any kind of a settlement reached? And they replied, no comment. So that time frame from when Mr. Detani told the government that he would be willing to make a commitment and ask the minister not to necessarily take the next steps to remove him from the role that led to his resignation, that has not been made public.
As you mentioned, the Justice Minister announced that they're going to start the process over again. Where does this leave the Human Rights Commission? This you mentioned off the top that this process to appoint Mr. Detani was quite lengthy. Could we be without the head of the Human Rights Commission for another extended period, or is this something the government's going to look to try and get done as quickly as they can?
So we're still waiting on timelines from the Justice Minister as to what this process is going to look like. And yes, it was 2 years when Mr. Detani was appointed to this role. But in the meantime, there is going to be someone stepping in to fill the chief commissioner role on an interim basis, as there was when Mr. Detani had been appointed. There is still going to be a level of scrutiny that's applied to what exactly happens with this commission, given the online harms bill as it makes its way through Parliament. As well, the questions are still being brought up by, say, the opposition Conservatives, as well as some prominent Jewish advocacy organizations, about how the government's vetting process allowed this to happen in the first place, with essentially the message being sent that they want to see some kind of improvements or some kind of tightening up of processes, which this whole episode has actually led the Privy Council to.
Well, certainly not what the federal government hoped would happen when they announced Mr. Detani's appointment, and I guess we'll see how this process is carried out going forward. Stephanie, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Stephanie Taylor. More from her at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.